Great. Hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me and some of my team along today. Obviously, really happy to be here. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name's Amy Breen. I'm head of sort of Green Lane policy and stakeholder engagement in HMRC. I'm joined by other colleagues in HMRC and in the Treasury as well, who will introduce themselves when they come in, because conscious of time, and I think a general introduction probably will just take up too much time. Just by way of overview, the plan for today's session is to talk through some of the key elements of the Windsor framework, and indeed other improvements that we've made for people moving their goods into Northern Ireland. I'll run through an initial timeline for the implementation of the key elements, and then I'll go through some of the areas of most interest to you in a bit more detail. So the duty reimbursement scheme, applying for UKIMS, new processes for TRQs and claiming waivers. And I think worth flagging at the start, I know Stephen might have something to say as well, is that we're focusing on what we would traditionally think of as customs policy today. So we're not going to focus on any of the SPS or agri-food elements, albeit I think those will not be as relevant for those on the call. But Stephen, I don't know if you wanted to say anything else at the beginning, or you're happy for me to kick on.
Just to say thank you, Amy, to you. Excuse me. Thank you, Amy, to you and your colleagues for joining us this afternoon. This is really important stuff. This is the beginning of the commitments that the UK government gave to Northern Ireland businesses as part of the Windsor Framework Agreement that it made with the European Union. There's a series of things that are beginning to wash out into the business community. Some of those we'll hear this morning, and other items will come later in the year. But just to reinforce the point that we're here with HMRC and with the Treasury, so these are customs related items and not stuff related to anything that's agricultural, etc., etc., etc. But if people do have any questions, please do put them in the chat or the Q&A function. And as Amy's going through the slides, towards the end, I'll pick out the questions that are most relevant, hopefully, and we'll have a bit of a Q&A then if possible. So Amy, I'll hand over to you.
Lovely, thanks, Stephen. Connor, I think you're sharing. Could you move on to the next slide? So in this one, I just wanted to quickly set out some of the implementation timeframes for the Windsor framework, because there's lots of things that are being staggered over quite a few different dates. And I know there's a lot of confusion because they don't necessarily all line up to the SPS dates as well. But I think worth flagging that already in effect, we've got unfettered access for Northern Ireland to GB movements. And I think the big thing there for people is there aren't any changes to the current process. So you will potentially still need to do something if you're moving goods that are under a special procedure or a sort of a prohibited or restricted good. They're the limited categories where you have to do an export declaration, but everything else is unfettered access. We've set out the process for new quotas that we've agreed with the EU for categories 7 and 17 of steel, and the UK internal market scheme has been launched. It was launched at the start of June, and I'll go into some of the detail about that as we go through. And then I say even more newly launched are sort of 3 different things in terms of the customs world. So the first is the duty reimbursement scheme. So that's where you've paid customs duty on goods moving from GB to NI, or indeed from the rest of the world to NI. You paid EU duty. Your goods have not moved into the EU, so you can reclaim that duty. We've improved the process for Customs Duty Waiver scheme, and I'll go into a bit more detail and a bit of a reminder about that. And we've also improved the process for TRQs as well, taking away some of the additional sort of forms that people had to do in addition to their customs declaration. Then in September this year, the new expanded trusted trader scheme comes into effect on the 30th of September. And by that date, we would hope everybody who was authorised for the UK trader scheme, the old trusted trader scheme, will have moved across to the new scheme. And then finally in September 2024, that's when the full green lane simplifications switch on. And in addition, that's when parcel data requirements come in for various different types of parcel movements. I'll move on to the next slide and get into some more detail, Connor, if that's okay. Lovely. So the next, the first sort of key area I'm going to focus on is the duty reimbursement scheme. And as I sort of highlighted at the beginning, the scheme allows traders to claim back EU duty charged on goods moved into Northern Ireland. So the goods were at risk at the point at which they moved into Northern Ireland, because often people just were not sure if the goods were staying in Northern Ireland or not, or moving into other parts of the EU. But that risk has not materialised. It will also in the future apply to goods moved under the red lane in the Windsor framework. So the scheme launched, as I said, at the end of last week, and traders have, for historical claims, that they've got 3 years to claim for duty going back to January 2021. So when the protocol came into place, they've got 3 years to make those historical claims. And then for any new movements from the 30th of June, there'll be sort of 3 years from that point to make a claim for reimbursement of that duty. And that's to try and take into account that, you know, particularly in the manufacturing world, but in other places as well, goods often sit in a warehouse for a long time before they're used, or they're used in a variety of different products, which might not sort of leave until much later, or the sort of final use isn't too much later. So it's really just to take that into account and give people quite a lot of time for that. In terms of the overview, and I'll go into a little bit more detail, you know, there's a sort of online service where people are able to make an application to reclaim, and then an HMRC caseworker will consider the application. If we could move on to the next slide, which talks about a little bit more about the different scenarios for reimbursement. We've tried not to be exhaustive in these lists, if that makes sense, because we want to, as far as we possibly can, accept wide ranges of evidence for people moving the goods into, or for people to sort of prove where the goods have gone after they've moved. But sort of we've got a list of likely reimbursement scenarios. So the goods have been sold for final use in Northern Ireland, they've been consumed in Northern Ireland, permanently installed or destroyed in Northern Ireland, or the goods have moved back to Great Britain or to the rest of the world. So anywhere that's not the EU, basically, are the sort of scenarios for reimbursement. And then in terms of the evidence requirements, we've put in a few different options here for traders, like the types of information that they may want to supply in terms of the evidence base. But we have tried to, as best we possibly can, not to be extremely prescriptive about those types of evidence, because, you know, not everybody has sales invoices or all of the transport documents that you might need. And that kind of thing. So I think a lot of times, because this is a new scheme, it will be a rather an iterative process for some people with HMRC, where you know, there might be a few different bits of evidence that people can provide. So I would say, bear with us a little bit at the beginning while we are trying to sort of work out, you know, what different things we can accept as well. Connor, do you want to move on to the next slide? Because there's a couple of good things worth highlighting. It is absolutely possible to make a partial claim under the scheme. So, for example, if you've brought sort of 30 widgets into Northern Ireland, and half of them have remained in Northern Ireland, and the other half or remains out of the EU, I should say, and the other half have moved into the EU, you can absolutely claim for the sort of 15 that remain, if that makes sense. We're trying to be as pragmatic as possible in terms of those partial claims. We know that some goods, can't be individually traced, for example, and that's where we'd want to, look at reasonable evidence that like the right proportion of goods is being claimed for in terms of what has stayed outside of the EU. The other thing that we are keen to sort of highlight about the scheme is that it is absolutely possible to submit bulk claims for multiple goods movements rather than a separate claim for each one. And that can cover up to sort of 250 separate movements. But it's worth just highlighting that they must all be for the same reimbursement condition. So all of those goods, for example, must have to have been destroyed in Northern Ireland or permanently installed. But you could do sort of different bulk claims as long as they all sit under that one header. And indeed, you at that point, the process is very slightly different, where you do have to sort of provide movement reference numbers for all of the consignments in the chain, but HMRC will sort of submit sort of a relevant proportion of additional information there for traders. So we won't be looking at every single piece of evidence there, albeit we will ask that traders do hold it, and of course if they don't hold it, we would request more information and that kind of thing. Great. Can we move on to the next slide on duty? So in terms of how to claim, the scheme launched on the 30th of June. And if you are either the importer of the original at-risk movement or an agent acting on behalf of the porter, you can make the claim. And if the claim is being made by a business not established in the UK, it would have to be an agent or representative established in the UK to submit the claim in your behalf. We've included the sort of link to the guidance on this page, and that takes you to the sort of online electronic form that you'd have to fill in. And to support the claim, obviously there'll be like the ability to attach to the form the various different pieces of evidence that may be required. Stephen, I don't know whether it's that's sort of the first bit on duty reimbursement. I don't know whether I should pause here or go and sort of try and cover all my areas and then come back for questions at the very end. So what works best for you?
I would power on, Amy, for now, and just to remind people that they're free to put questions into either the Q&A or the chat. We've had a couple in there already, but we'll pick them up at the end.
Lovely, great. So if we could move on to the next section, that would be great. So that's our Customs Duty Waiver scheme, and just to kind of remind everybody. What that is traders can claim a customs duty waiver on the EU portion of their customs duty if it's rest of world to NI, or the sort of whole of the EU customs duty for GB to NI movement, up to sort of certain thresholds. For most businesses, that's 200,000 euros over a 3-year period. It's a 3-year rolling period, and sort of in addition, worth highlighting that that's going to increase, I think, in January to a slightly bigger amount because the EU's de minimis has increased. That's for goods at risk moving into Northern Ireland. Currently, the process. I think the second thing to highlight there is that that sort of amount is for an undertaking, so like essentially a business controlled by the same entity. So if business A is a parent company of business B, it's a collective allowance of 200,000 euros over 3 years, as opposed to an allowance for an individual business. And kind of as listed on the slides, there are different de minimis allowances for for a few other industries, road freight, agriculture and fisheries, where the amounts are significantly lower. And de minimis aid does indeed include any de minimis aid that you might get from another government department or agencies outside of customs duty. And that's where we'd want to, and it's sort of key that we take that into account when administering the customs bit of the scheme. If we want to just move on to the next slide, I think the big thing I wanted to highlight here is that there aren't any big changes here, apart from the fact that we are making the process much, much easier for businesses. So at the minute, you have to do, or had to do, a print and post form every 3 months, manually checking the amount of customs duty waiver you had claimed, and whether there had been any changes to the rest of your business in terms of the customs duty that they had claimed. Whereas from September 2023, that will be all done electronically. So on the 3rd of July, we opened up a new registration service for a company to sign up. And they can put all the information in there, and it will mean that a trader doesn't have to do sort of the additional burdensome process. And it also means that, you know, one person can do the update for sort of the whole undertaking, rather than individual businesses having to sort it out. And I think the key thing as well is this will really help with the administration of the scheme, both for traders and indeed for HMRC, admittedly, in that it will mean that the customs declaration system will prevent claims where people would go over their de minimis, and that will significantly reduce the chances of a sort of overpayment and a recovery proceeding sort of on behalf of HMRC. So I think all in all, a much better service to customers on that one. That's a fairly quick one. We'll move on to the next slide, which is on the Trusted Trader Scheme. And so what I wanted to highlight here is the Trusted Trader Scheme, of course, underpins the Green Lane, and it will sort of be the new Trusted Trader Scheme for moving your goods into Northern Ireland, and make full use of the Green Lane from the 30th of September 2024. But it is also the way from the 30th of September 2023 that you can continue to get tariff-free movement of goods into Northern Ireland. So you need to be registered for UKIMS to be able to declare your goods not at risk in the way that you needed to be registered with the UKTS previously. So just worth highlighting that HMRC has contacted everybody who was registered under UKTS, and to sort of encourage them to register and apply for the new authorization. In terms of the changes to the scheme for eligibility, the scheme is now available for traders anywhere in the UK. Previously, the UKTS was only available for Northern Ireland established traders, but this means a GB business wanting to import into Northern Ireland can make use of the scheme. We've also made some changes to the commercial processing rules, and to sort of expand the situations where the people doing processing can access the scheme. So firstly, under the new scheme, if goods are for processing, the processed goods are for use for animal feed, healthcare and construction, and not for profit sectors, they'll be eligible to move via the Green Lane. And those goods will be able to do so even if they're intermediaries or they sell on for an eventual product. And so that's an improvement to the current arrangements. And secondly, the turnover threshold below which companies involved in processing can move goods will be increased from September from 500,000 up to 2 million. And I think we're saying because of the new benefits, obviously that means people do need to be reauthorised under this scheme, and there are some additional requirements in the new form, such as the business needs to be of good financial standing and showing sort of clear obligations of your understanding of your obligations under the scheme. I don't know if we want to move on to the next slide. Brilliant. So this just covers a little bit of the registration process. So as I said, the scheme was launched at the start of June, and you can register now for UKIM. I think we are encouraging traders as much as possible to apply for the scheme by the 31st of July 2023, and that's really to guarantee that we can prioritise and allow traders to be enrolled under UKIMS by the 30th of September. It's absolutely not saying that if you don't meet this deadline, you might not get in on time. We're still going to work as quickly as possible, and obviously we don't want any gaps in people being able to declare their goods not at risk. So please do try and get in contact with us or fill in your form and get it in as full as possible. I know we've had some initial feedback on the form, so I would say if you're worried about completing the form or the registration process, or you need more information or support from us, please do get in contact. You can absolutely register with the TSS, who are supporting with the process. My understanding is that they're planning to do a sort of webinar walkthrough of the form at some point in the very near future. But also you can directly contact HMRC as well, where we can sort of advise over the phone. And there's a couple of numbers on the slides here where you can contact us directly. So yeah, I would say lots of help out there to help people fill in the form. We're trying to make the process absolutely as easy as possible. And I suppose compared to the UKIM form, it is intended to be, it's a fully digital process, and it's sort of intended to be easier for traders to do, albeit we do require some information in this space. And then finally, should we move on to the last slide, which is just on TRQs, tariff rate quotas. So as I mentioned at the start of the call, we've got a new agreement with the EU for category 7 and 17 of steel, where we've agreed a brand new sort of quota pot specifically for GB to NI movements of those steel. That's in addition to traders still having access to the global quota pot. And I think the big thing to say in terms of the Windsor framework is that there is now an established process with the EU to ensure the sort of where other issues with TRQs arise in the future, there'll be a forum for dealing with them and trying to find solutions where traders cannot bring their goods into Northern Ireland without sort of facing those astronomical tariffs. We've also made improvements to the overall TRQ process. So the big thing there is up until a few days ago, traders had to submit additional forms alongside their customs declaration in order to access tariff rate quotas, and that was both in terms of movements from GB and from the rest of the world. So from the 1st of July, all of that information will be collected on a customs declaration, and we've issued some guidance to traders through the trade bodies. Stephen, I hope you've received it and sent it out, but please shout if you haven't, and we can absolutely share it with this group afterwards. And it just gives a little bit more information about how that's going to be done on a customs declaration, and hopefully a much easier process for people to follow, and not having to do a couple of separate forms and different bits of admin. I think, you know, the TRQ process, particularly in terms of steel, is not finished. We are absolutely acutely aware that there are other categories of goods that do face difficulties when they're moving to NI, either from GB or the rest of the world. And you know, we're sort of using the channels in the Windsor framework to continue to lobby the EU on your behalf and come up with any process. Any sort of further processes and issues. And I suppose I'd say I'd welcome any feedback from this group on particular difficulties in that area. Steel, which will be of interest to this group, is of a particular priority, but we're absolutely sort of open to hearing evidence and anything else in terms of difficulties that you might be having. And I think it's worth saying we're also looking to sort of continue to upgrade the way sort of we administer TRQs for goods moving into Northern Ireland. We know it's not been the easiest process to follow, and a lot of things had to be set up at the very last moment back whenever the protocol first came into force. And it's just taken us sort of time to figure out how we can make that as easy as possible for stakeholders. So there may be a few minor updates on the way, but they are intended to make life easier, not more difficult. So just wanted to flag that we'll be in touch with some of those further improvements. I'm going to stop there. That probably seems like reasonable to have done half an hour of talking, and sort of very willing for myself and some colleagues to take any questions you might have on that. I do have sort of additional slides sitting in the background on the green lane and mixed loads and things like that. So if people want to ask about those, I'm happy to pop something up. But hopefully I've covered the most relevant issues for this group.
Amy, thanks very much for that. We have a number of questions already raised, so I'll encourage colleagues, if they do have those, to put them into the chat or the Q&A, and we can go through them. And I know some of your other colleagues from HMRC and Treasury are in the background there, should there be anything kind of specific to be picked up there as well. But I'll start with an easy one for you, because I know the answer to this myself. Does the 3 year of reimbursement of duty on goods imported in January 2021 commence on the 30th of June 2023 when the scheme was launched, or from January 2021? So that's a question about how far back can people go, and now that the scheme's launched, can they claim for things back as far as January 21?
So you can go back as far as January 2021, and you have 3 years from the 30th of June 2023 to make those historical claims. Any sort of movements of goods after the 30th of January 2023, you have 3 years from the point of the movement to make the claim. Does that make sense? It
does, yeah. It does. Basically, you can claim what you want right back to 2021 now, and you've still got 3 years to do that. That's the kind of critical thing. You finished there with TRQs, and I know it's an interest for our engineering sector. Question here from Jonathan Walsh. Reference the new TRQ requirements, in particular for steel. Will TSS recognise quota ON outside Section 7 and 17? Because there's been issues there with companies on that up until now.
Yeah, so they will. We've sent direct guidance to your colleagues in the TSS on that, but we are aware that there have been some issues with the TSS, and they are updating so we've updated TSS, if that makes sense, and they're updating their internal guidance as well on how to access and use the sort of free text box that you have to use to put in the quota order number. So it will, I think they're just in the process of updating their process on how physically it's done, if that makes sense, but it's absolutely intended that the process will work with the TSS.
Okay, so that should address those issues of some of those error codes that some people were reporting or frustrated about. Can duty be claimed back on goods which have preferential origin, brackets UK? These could have been claimed, but wasn't, as client didn't realise and paid the duty as opposed to waiving. So there's people at this point have already paid some duty, and now that duty reimbursement scheme is up and running, where they've perhaps paid this in error because the system wasn't up and running. What's the kind of view of HMRC on that, and what's the kind of process involved?
Yeah, I would say you can claim back the sort of preferential origin where you just didn't realise that you had to put something in. It wasn't necessarily the concept of the duty reimbursement scheme, but I think in these instances, absolutely that you can claim, particularly if you can sort of show you meet the sort of rules of origin requirements, or you met them at the time, if that makes sense. So yeah, we would expect that to be able to be done.
That's good news. And that's the value of conversations like this as well. So if people do have questions, even if they feel that they're maybe quite low level, do ask them, because it's important that we work together on getting these things resolved. Question here, we have
sorry,
go ahead.
Stephen. Actually, one more thing to add. Like, obviously, that could be done under the duty reimbursement scheme if you could also prove it didn't go into the EU, because that's the point of the scheme. There may be, if it's a genuine error on your declaration, there are other sort of reimbursement routes for that as well. If you didn't necessarily meet that sort of that last criteria of it not going into the EU. But if it doesn't go into the EU and it was at risk, it can be done through duty reimbursement.
Thanks for that. Question here, we have specific supplementary declarations that move into general stock. So people bring stuff into a kind of stock holding. The vast majority of these stay in Northern Ireland, but some do go to Ireland or the rest of the EU. There's no direct link between the stock which is in versus the stock that's out, so they can't track which individual item goes to which particular customer. Can they still claim reimbursement? This is kind of leading us into the realms of apportionment, I would suggest, as well.
It is, and I think, like, particularly where individual items can't be traced, and we're trying to make we're trying to be as pragmatic as possible. What I would say is, this will probably have to be looked at on a case by case basis. But we're going to try and put out some examples as well for people soon on this, because it's something that's come up a few times in terms of duty reimbursement. So I'd say we want to be as pragmatic as possible. We'll have to look at it in terms of a case to case basis and see what information can be provided. And we'll try and provide some further clarity and guidance for people very soon, if that makes sense.
So at this point in time, on that, on those that may be a case by case, how do they access? Do they just sit and wait for this new guidance to come out, and then there'll be a route through for them at that point, or?
I would encourage them to still submit their claims. We, on the policy side, will be in touch with our colleagues processing this. They know it's an issue that is going to come up. So submit the claims, and like actually giving them our sort of operational colleagues a sort of process. Some of the information that can be provided means that we can work through what a good process might look like for those people. So I'd absolutely encourage people to put something in, because it actually allows us to see what evidence they can provide and then work through the best possible course of action for an individual.
Okay, so the critical thing here is to provide visibility to this,
yeah,
and then stuff that's maybe on the edges or got little wrinkles in the system can be identified. But unless you have sight of it, then there's no way of dealing with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, we want to have sight of it because we want to be as pragmatic as possible and figure out the best possible course through. Obviously, we have to balance that with, a bit of robustness to the scheme. You can't just say, oh, we had 100 of these, and off the top of my head, I think 10 of them went to the EU. Like a bit of evidence would be helpful, but we'll try and be as pragmatic as possible with the evidence that can be provided.
Yeah, so having an honest looking face isn't enough. You need some evidence there as well, basically. So question here, linked to the previous quarterly customs waiver form doesn't appear to be available anymore. Amy, you mentioned the new digital process due to start in September, but what about this last quarter to July the 5th, 2023?
That's very technical. Zach, I don't know if you've got any clarity on that, on why it's not available online anymore. Or it might be just something we have to take away, Stephen, and come back.
We can take away, unless you're in the agri and fishery sector, you can use the digital service from now. So from September, it will be a mandatory requirement to be on the service to make a claim, and CDS will not process a claim if you're not on the service. But to give traders time to prepare, they should start using the service now and register now, so you can report your next quarterly claim on the service essentially. So you don't need to do the print and post and the digital service at the same time. You can just use the digital service from now on. Does that help?
It does, because it is a very technical thing that frankly is well beyond my capabilities. So that questioner, I'm sure, can contact HMRC and maybe point them to the kind of challenge that's there at the moment. I'm sure he will do. A question here: we currently import raw materials from GB for machining into components in Northern Ireland. Finished goods are then sold to customers in Northern Ireland and back to GB. We have no customers in the EU. We hold full traceability of all components. Our turnover does exceed the 2 million threshold. Does this mean we are unable to apply for or use UKIMS, and would therefore have to pay duty on all movements of this material, and then submit claims to HMRC through the reimbursement scheme when the sale takes place in Northern Ireland, or when the sale takes place to either Northern Ireland or UK customers? So this is partly about how open is the UKIMS system and scheme for people. And kind of taking this back a little step, whenever the protocol was first operationalized back in January 2021, there was some confusion that manufacturers could not participate in the UK trader scheme, but they could, because they're moving some of their own items. They're moving stuff that's quite clearly for internal consumption within their business. Could be the tea bags for the tea room, etc., etc., etc. So a lot of manufacturers didn't register with UKTS. So I suppose the first part of that question, before we get into the specific detail, Amy, is how open is UK internal market scheme system? Can manufacturers and commercial processors apply to it? Can they use it for some of the movements, if not all of their movements?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to say is, if the goods aren't being commercially processed, so if you're bringing in, I don't know, I say drills and desks and computers are the things that spring to my mind that, you know, a business will be bringing over. Like absolutely, you can be registered for UKIMS and move those goods through the green lane or declare them not at risk, because they're, you know, not being processed. It's not like a prerequisite to absolutely every good that you bring over. If your goods are for commercial processing, then, you know, unfortunately, if you're over the threshold, or indeed you don't sort of fit into the sort of sectoral exemptions, then you will have to do the sort of upfront process of paying your sort of customs duty on the form, albeit there might be a way to delay it slightly and very quickly reply for a reimbursement to sort of to help with that cash flow. For example, if you had your reimbursement claim in before you before the sort of duty was taken from the supplementary declaration, there is probably a quick way of getting that that duty back, or having very limited impact on the cash flow. But I say, unfortunately, if you're bringing goods in for commercial processing, those are just the rules that we've had to agree with the EU.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Can you say something on the non-EU goods imported into GB where a tariff has been paid? What happens if these goods are subsequently sold on for further processing in Northern Ireland and therefore at risk? Are EU tariffs then payable on GB TNI movements? And if so, can the original tariff be recovered? So this is rest of world goods going to a GB distributor, for want of a customer type, that move onwards then into Northern Ireland, and an EU tariff, because it doesn't pick up any new origin, an EU tariff is then potentially applied at that point. So which part of the tariff is claimable there, and how far back can that reach go?
So in terms of rest of world origin goods, what you can claim the difference is the difference between so if it's a GB to NI movement and you paid full EU duty on that, then that full reimbursement can be paid. If you've never paid customs duty in GB and then you've moved it into Northern Ireland as a rest of world to NI movement, if that makes sense, then the difference between EU duty and GB duty can be claimed. So where EU duty is higher than GB duty, then you can claim that. So the position will always be, even if you paid your customs duty in GB, your GB customs duty, that will always have to be paid, but you'll never have to pay the EU duty, or you can reimburse the EU duty if that makes sense. If the good never moves into the EU.
So I think it would probably be pretty helpful for you and colleagues in HMRC and maybe Treasury, if that questioner, I know who it is, if they emailed me that scenario and maybe give some practical information around it, that would help kind of as a bit of a case study, that would be useful. So if Peter, if you could send that through to me, that would be really helpful, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I know there's a couple of different scenarios where you might pay duty in both GB and on movement into NI, or you could sort of suspend the duty in GB and pay the whole thing as you move into NI. So yeah, there's definitely a couple of different ways you can cut it there. So we can look at various different options.
Yeah, and there's going to be quite a lot of movements like that because GB still maintains an important position as a centre of distribution of rest of world goods for Northern Ireland manufacturers and others. So getting that kind of case study and a couple of scenarios there would be useful as advice for the rest of the sector on gov.uk when we get to that point. A question here, you mentioned understanding that larger manufacturers don't track each individual part through the production process and that reasonable evidence for proportion of goods that are staying outside of the EU will be considered. How do we put this into practice? Do we need to engage with HMRC do you need to engage with our HMRC representatives to agree what will be acceptable? So that's partly about apportionment and making sure that people are using that, and partly about how they then use that as part of the transaction with HMRC on moving these items.
I agree, Stephen. I think this sort of links back to the sort of similar scenario to earlier that this will be very much a sort of case by case basis. We're hoping to get some case studies out on these particular things because we know, lots of things go into a manufacturing process and you don't necessarily, count out the ones that are going into the Republic of Ireland. We're absolutely aware of that. Another one of those case by case ones, I'd say submit what you've got to HMRC, and we'll also put out guidance, and we can sort of see where we get to with that. But we're trying to be as pragmatic as possible. So whatever evidence you can provide is the most helpful one.
Great. As a wholesaler, goods are not at risk until the point of sale. If a sale to an EU state occurs, it is either accounted through apportionment or on the basis of invoiced sales, intrastat dispatches, so the people complete their intrastat VAT return. Will the Green Lane and then current TSS waiver declarations for all subsequent EU movements remain a satisfactory and approved method? So people have over the last 2.5 years found a rhythm and a method of working. So can people still use some of those, or do we need to start again for some of these people?
So I think this relates to apportionment, and I would say for now, you can keep doing what you're doing in terms of apportionment. What we'll have, it is a bit of a policy area that's under review at the minute, given the new parameters in the Windsor framework. So we're trying to provide sort of future clarity as soon as we possibly can on that one. But I'd say keep doing what you're doing at the minute. If there are changes to how apportionment works, we'll be in touch with clarity and guidance on it.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that once these things that are becoming visible to people, the Tariff reimbursement scheme, etc., 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 that will leave a cohort of more interesting or tricky or funky movements that may not be covered in the schemes that are already launched. And to be fair to HMRC, you've always said that you're willing to review those to ensure that those areas are covered off. So yeah, continue as was, but use the new systems and see what's left at the other end. Same questioner talks about the use of Intrastat, but I know that HMRC have kind of considered some of that stuff with colleagues in the EU, and the system is the system at this point in time, at least. Question here, can you send a link for the new de minimis digital service, as links we have received from TSS don't appear to have a registration link?
No problem. Zach, I'm going to ask you to put the link in the chat if you possibly can. Well,
And people are already giving customs advice to other people on the call here and encouraging people to look at inward processing relief as well. Fair play to you, Jonathan. A carrier transporting green and red lane shipments on the same truck, will green lane shipments be delayed for checks?
you know, I think the first thing I'd say is, we're not expecting any changes. The red lane is basically how things work today. So we're not expecting all of a sudden the red lane to become this absolutely awful thing that everybody stopped for everything. We expect it to work very much in the same way as customs works today. So in, we expect very, very few stops at the port in the same way as happens today. There will be risk-based checks regardless. Obviously, if you're carrying a good that absolutely needs a physical check at the port, and that's in a truck with green lane goods, there's nothing we can do about that. But those are few and far between. We're not planning to stop lots of goods at the port, and we're trying to work through processes whereby if something does need a check, it could be done away from ports, because we just do not want things to be congested there.
Thank you. There's a kind of question here largely around the carrying of small packages. And it's about, I suppose in some respects, it's about who has the compliance responsibility. That's the first thing. And secondly, it kind of leads out to a piece of work that's still not visible to people on this call, which is the stuff that's going to be done around business to business parcels. So rather than going into detail on that one for now, can you just kind of talk about what types of things are probably lying out ahead for people to see once these things begin to bed in? There's other stuff coming down the track, and what the intention is in and around parcels as an ambition, at least for now.
I won't go into a massive amount of detail here, and the reason being that we are sort of working very, very closely with the sort of fast parcel industry to make this process as workable and as slick as possible, and try and sort of not have anything massively onerous for sort of customers moving business to business parcels. Albeit we cannot guarantee that there won't be some changes here. For sort of consumer movements, those changes are going to be much more minimal. So the big thing I would say, no changes to September 2024. We're working with the industry to get a suitable solution here, particularly in terms of things like liability and sort of checking relevant authorizations. You don't have to do anything now, and as soon as we get into a position where we can share the sort of exact process, Stephen, I can guarantee that this group will be one of the first that we come and talk to.
Well, it'll remove a quarter of my workload instantly, Amy, so I'll look forward to that. Amy, I don't have any other questions for now, other than one myself, which is what can people expect? Just remind people what they can expect to happen over the next number of months, because unlike the protocol, which everything landed all in at 12:minutes on New Year's Day, this is a process rather than a moment. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So I think the next big thing will obviously be the big transfer from UKTS to UKIMS from the 30th of September this year. And then kind of looking beyond that, I think we as HMRC will be coming out at sort of quite strategic points throughout the year to give more information about some of the green lane changes in preparation for that September 2024 deadline. So I would say information about how the trader profile will work. So that's sort of to ensure that people don't have to put in a commodity code per movement, and it can be done on a goods description. More information about the data set that will be required for a GB to NI movement, albeit we published some information there, but we'd be sort of sending technical specifications to agents and things like that throughout the year. And then I think we would just be going into much more granular levels of detail about the green lane process over the year. So it will be very much staged over the next year to get everybody in a place where they can prepare, hopefully with good time for the green lane for the green lane facilitations. And I think the other thing to say is all of the green state lane stuff is intended to make it easier. We are not suddenly making the red lane into something that is any more difficult than what traders are doing today. We don't intend to do lots of checks, and the paperwork will remain the same in the red lane. We're not imagining big changes there. So anything, I suppose, is supposed to be a bonus and a facilitation rather than anything else.
Yeah, I think the ambition going into the last round of negotiations was that the situation that people were in that day was the baseline, was the floor, and it was about raising that floor rather than raising the ceiling on this stuff. So it's about making life easier. Amy, I'm assuming that HMRC and others, as people expose themselves to the new systems that are live, that if people have issues, queries, concerns, good advice, seek more clarity that would help not just themselves but other traders, you're very welcome to, or you're very open to welcoming that type of feedback at this point.
Oh, absolutely. We want to hear all the feedback there is, and we don't want to be in a position, we're kind of working very hard not to be in a position like when the protocol itself arrived on people's doorsteps and we were still trying to work out how it would work in December. I certainly don't want to revisit those days ever again. So I'm sure most people here don't either. So yeah, like we want the feedback now, we want it early, we want to engage with you, and we want to make the process as good as possible.
And people can do that either directly to the HMRC, to TSS, but if people are more comfortable sending it to me, then I'm happy to share those on as well. So yeah, Amy, I have nothing else unless you have any final words you'd like to say. Other than that, just to say thank you very much to yourself, Zach, Carmel, all your other colleagues are on the call should they be required. Thankfully we haven't needed them too often, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
No, and thank you, Stephen. Obviously we've got a good working relationship with you, and it's been really, really helpful to have your sort of support in facilitating this meeting as well. And I would say, to you and your members, if there are other things that it would be helpful for us as HMRC to come and talk about, or indeed sort of ask some of our other colleagues across government to come and talk to this group about, please just let us know. We can organise another meeting like this. Otherwise, we'll sort of look strategically beyond September whenever we've got more information about the green lane to come out to this group as well.
That's great. Thanks very much, Amy. Bye now.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.